necessary at this time. And I think we can find a better subject to start this dialogue than this issue, populism, media, and journalism. So I think that it's very important as a political position and a political step to discuss this subject to a larger audience. So I'm really happy to participate of this live, to be part of this process. And now I can give the floor to Julián Durazerman, that your colleague from UCAM, and one of the guest editors of this special issue, so can tell us more about the subject, populism, media, and journalism, and about the editing process. Thank you.
For the delay. So thank you, Fabio and Tanya and Allison and everybody at BJR for your invitation, and thank you all for being here. So the special issue on populism, media, and journalism is a joint project between LACPOP and BJR. LACPOP being, as Tanya mentioned, the Political Communication and Public Opinion Lab at UCAM, where we have had a long-standing interest in populism, and we've had other talks and discussions about it. So it was something that was already in our head when we received BJR's proposal to do something more formal and serious about it, and it's actually got us into thinking and questioning what the role between, or the links between populism and media and journalism are. And one of the first things that came to our mind, of course, is the fact that populism is itself a very large and difficult concept. So instead of trying to narrow everything down to something that would be extremely constraining, we ended up proposing a very long list of questions to in our call for papers, and I will just read them to you so that you have an idea of what was behind our mind when we decided to participate in this project. So the questions were: how does the media cover populist parties, and what role do journalists play in delegitimizing populist ideas? D in parentheses, so both legitimizing and delegitimizing. How do populist discourses shape and reshape party competition in hyper-mediated environments? How do we understand the nature of populist rhetoric in a given context in terms of its evolution, the way in which elites are constructed, and the way in which the authentic people is defined? And last but not least, how have populist movements constructed the media and journalists? So this was the core of our call for papers, and we were very lucky to have a significant response. And the result is the special issue that you can consult. I put it in the chat box, the link to the journal itself, which is also open access. So we invite you to all take a look at it and read and interact with the articles. So we received the articles and all the double-blind evaluations and so forth. And then when the time came to publish the journal, we had to write an introduction. And that was another very exciting moment, because we had to find a way to deal with the responses that the authors provided, and at the same time pursue our thoughts on what the relations are between populism, media, and journalism. So the introduction that we prepared presents these results in three dimensions. The first one is trying to contribute to a media relevant definition of populism. The second one, thinking again about media journalism and politics in times of populism. And finally, taking stock of the fact that we are living through a pandemic, and that social media populism, as we defined it, is directly related to the pandemic. We try to extract theoretical insights from what could have otherwise been simple conjunctural analysis. So rather than take too much time and go into depth, I invite you to read the intro and the articles and see if we have fulfilled our task of providing for a comparative, globally relevant discussion on media, populism, and journalism. I have a few questions for the authors. The idea is actually to engage in a debate and to invite the members of the public to ask their own questions. So very quickly, the questions for the authors are, how new are the new media trends and populism? So we coined up this neologism, social media-based populism, but how far are we going into actually defining something that's new? A second element that's present in the various articles of our special issue is the notion of the media criticizing journalism. So this notion of meta journalism, how is it related to populism? And finally, maybe you can help us look ahead and think of what needs to be done to further understand what the links are between populism, media, and journalism. Thank you so much.
Cedric, I don't know if you want to start presenting first or answering after.
Or maybe I can start the presentation, and if it's okay for you, of course, and maybe I will be able to answer or give some part of answer within the presentation, or maybe it's better to proceed like this. It's okay. So I start the presentation. Hi everyone, I'm Cedric Time, I'm a researcher at Saint Louis, Université Saint-Louis in Belgium. So I wrote a short text in order not to exceed the 10 minutes and to leave time for the discussion. So the article I wrote questions the critique or critiques of traditional journalism by a media close to a left populist party. More specifically, I try to understand how these critiques have a meta discursive dimension. So we will be able, I think, to discuss about meta journalism. The article is based on two observations. The first is that the critique that targets the media and particular journalists are diverse, coming from politicians, certain social groups, intellectuals, etc. So I chose to start from this observation to choose a rather particular critique, the critique coming from another journalistic medium, which is not particularly new in Europe, but which I think it's developing more and more from the past few years. The second observation is that many critics of journalistic practices focus on the belonging of journalists to the elite, with which, for example, politicians are also associated. For many authors, like Benjamin de Klein, the opposition between the people and the elite refers directly to populist discourses. And that is why I wanted to question the journalistic productions of a media whose editorial line is close to a populist party. The challenge for traditional journalists then lies in their ability of being legitimate in the eyes of a part of the population, which is increasingly skeptical and suspicious about the institutions or institutional settings. So the media I've chosen is called Le Média in French, which is the media. It's a media close to La France Insoumise, which is described as a populist party by Castagno. Le Média is quite interesting because since its creation, its sense has been almost the critique or criticism of another media and journalist, traditional journalist. On its website, for example, one can read that Le Média, through its free access, tries to fulfill the public information service mission that is now disappearing in the media landscape. So the article aims to understand the critique of the media by another medium that fits this type of critique with a strong distinction between the people and the elites. From these elements, it's possible to bring out a central aspect of the research. The critiques addressed to the traditional or legacy media, especially those that come from another media, can refer to a meta-journalistic dimension. In other words, to a discourse reflection on journalism. I'm thinking on the work of Carlson or Ogbo, who points out the meta-journalist discourses. So the research question of the article is, how does the meta-journalistic component of the critique addressed by the media to traditional journalists express itself in its journalistic productions? So I won't now talk about the methodology to talk to a large audience, but don't hesitate to ask some issues like on methodology. So the results show that the media uses its journalistic production to produce a critique of legacy or traditional journalism. That's a strong meta-discursive dimension. In fact, the media gives what is legitimate and what is not in the practices of traditional journalists. In other words, what is or what should be journalism. This observation has been structured in the article through three parts. The first analyzes how the media opposes the people and the traditional dominant journalists who constitute the non-citizen elite. This meta-journalistic process tends to show that journalism should work for the people. Traditional media therefore lose an important social good for the media, public and citizen legitimacy. By only relying through the power, the dominant media, they legitimize their own role within a society that has withdrawn all credit from the ruling classes and therefore indirectly from the traditional media. The second point of the analysis intends to identify the meta-journalistic aspects which participate in delegitimizing journalists and in withdrawing the public or citizen trust in the media. The media believe that traditional journalists no longer have the legitimacy of the people from several points, such as their belonging to the liberal world, their use of certain sources of information that come from the government or other people belonging to the same elites as journalists. Finally, the analysis highlights the importance that the media give to journalism and public information considered as a social good essential to democracy. Such a point of view reinforces the idea of a meta-journalistic component of the media discourses. In fact, through its critique, it points the importance of journalism as much as it delimits its borders. Finally, the media does not question journalism in any way, but rather the way in which it's practiced by traditional journalists. According to the media, journalism is essential because it serves as a guarantee for the people, a guarantee of being particularly well represented by politicians. To quickly conclude, I would like to point out that this article has several contributions that articulate critique of the traditional journalist with meta-journalism. It points out the intricacy between the meta-journalistic discourse and the critique of the media and journalists by another media. Moreover, the unsteady character of the critique of the media and journalists has been identified in the corpus, which invites us to understand this critique from several objects and actors, as it can refer to very different considerations. However, it is possible to identify constancy in this critique, such as the non-respect of certain values and certain rules necessary for journalism. In this sense, the research shows that the meta-journalistic discourse that arises from such critique carries journalistic renewal through a new normativity and a new communication contract between journalists and the public or the people. As such, I believe that the journalistic production offered by the media reflects its populist tendency, but gives a meta-journalistic reflection, which, in my opinion, goes beyond a simple populist project, simple in the sense that it's not just a political project, but a real meta-discourse on journalism and its mutation. So I've done now. I think I've respected the time, the 10 minutes. So thank you for having listened to me, and maybe I can now listen to Nina's speech, I think.
Thank you very much, Cédric. Nina, if you would like to start your presentation.
Yes, so thank you very much. First, for the opportunity of sharing this work with greater public, let's put it like that. It's always a pleasure to not only to share, but also to have the opportunity to listen to criticism, to suggestions, to doubts. I think helps us to further our thoughts about this topic that is certainly one of the main topics of the moment, especially here in Brazil. I cannot start, of course, without thanking also my co-author, so Camila Cesar, that is a dear friend that was a great partner in this work. She couldn't be here with us today, but she's a central part of this work, so I would like to thank her. And I also prepared a little text, so I don't lose myself in time, but I will try to make this presentation dialogue a little bit with the questions that were posed by Julian that I think are very interesting to think about this phenomenon. So the aim of the study that we did was to understand how the term populism was being used in Brazilian media during the pandemic. We were especially interested in analyzing if there were new frames of the issue, new forms of thinking about populism that emerged during the sanitary crisis. We draw upon other studies, previous studies, of course, and essays that tries to establish different effects that the pandemic could have on populist leaders. It's important to recall that at the beginning of the pandemic, of the sanitary crisis, almost 2 years ago here in Brazil, there were major discussions about what kind of politicians, and policies that unusual situation was going to encourage. Would populist leaders find the perfect arena to build their image as saviors and heroes fighting against the evil? And that evil could be China, the pharmaceutical companies, or national political adversaries? Or would this kind of leaders actually lose space in face of the need for fast and strong scientifically based measures to face the pandemic? Amid these controversies, Brazil lived its own drama as the president Jair Bolsonaro, since the beginning of the pandemic, chose to diminish its importance, comparing it to a little cold. That meant that not only in the last 2 years, we never had a national health policy to face the pandemic, but also that social measures to counter the effects of the virus and of the isolation measures were never efficiently taken. With that in mind, we chose a diversified corpus of news published in major national news outlets in Brazil. We gathered 170 news articles published between March March 1st and October 1st, 2020. And we developed 3 kinds of analysis, but I'm not going to go into them, all of them here, of course. So I'm going to focus on the main analysis that was about what frames most appeared in this coverage, and were these frames of populism different from other frames that were previously identified by other studies and authors. First, so I'll just jump to the conclusions of the article. I think that's the main point that we can debate here. And of course, I'm open to any questions on the theoretical background, methodology, and things like that, if you wish to, that I further develop that on the discussion. So first, far from the speculation that the pandemic would mean the death of populism due to the rise of expert knowledge, what we saw was an adaptation of its meaning. In that sense, if we compare the frames identified in the work with other research results in non-pandemic contexts, significant differences were identified. Our hypothesis that the negationist behavior of Bolsonaro's government induced the association of populism with anti-science discourse was confirmed, and it was the most common frame, representing 31% of our corpus. The rapprochement of these 2 concepts, populism and anti-science, is clearly a characteristic of the pandemic crisis period, as it views populism as an opposition between saving the economy and saving lives. Those were specific contextual frames that were very significant in our corpus. Nonetheless, that does not mean that the traditional and long-standing frames of populism did not appear. They were actually very important. On the contrary, our 7 months of analysis have allowed us to verify that issues related to the nature of populism in terms of political form and expression, as well as its aesthetic terms, remain essential to understanding the phenomenon. In that way, the frames democratic threat, nationalism, political movement, and empty rhetoric demonstrate that the construction of the meaning of populism in media also involves the association with variables of a political, cultural, and discursive nature. In the same vein, these differences explain why the terms populism or populist sometimes designated actors and parties on the left, sometimes on the right. An interesting element to highlight here concerns the discussion in the Brazilian media sphere about a right-wing populism as opposed to populism historically associated with the predominant left-wing leaders in Latin America, including Brazil. It shows how articulations between populism and pandemic crisis in the media discourse helps to open new perspectives on forms and understanding of populist phenomenon in the country. Another point that was that caught our attention during the study is that we identified significant changes in the frames along the analyzed period. So along our 7 months of analysis, we identified that the anti-science frame was highly used at the beginning of the analyzed period, at the beginning of the pandemic, because I'm talking about March 2020, achieving its peak in April and May. It's no coincidence that these months correspond to the moment when COVID-19 emerged as a public health problem on an international level. Thus, the high number of articles addressing populism from an anti-scientific perspective would be explained by the mediation of scornful and misleading statements by actors such as Bolsonaro, but not only, and Trump in the first months of the pandemic. This scenario increases the pressure on governments and political actors whose declarations and actions downplay the increasing risks of contagion under the spotlight of the national and foreign press. President Bolsonaro frivolity in the face of the evolving pandemic and the absence of cooperation between federal, regional, and local administrations favor the appearance of another topic related to the issue of populism, the economy. So in the opposite sense, when we look at our timeline, the economic policies and the democratic threat frames, they gain relevance in the second half of the analyzed period. Both are most mentioned in the last 2 months we analyzed. Those findings appear to indicate that after some initial worry about attacks on scientific knowledge and facts, as the pandemic lingers and the actions of governments becomes more important, political and economic aspects take the center of the stage. These shifts in meaning of populism are consistent with the concept of populism as a political logic and thus deeply related to the social and political circumstances of a certain territory. That does not entail completely the new appropriations of the concept, but rather an intense and continuous negotiation process within political forces in a given situation. This represents a challenge to the literature on populism that, on one hand, has to avoid simplistic and episodic interpretations of the phenomenon that deny its historical roots, and, on the other hand, needs to deeply comprehend the contextual appropriations of the concept. In this second approach, the role of media is specifically relevant due to its temporal dynamic, tracking closely daily events. This process plays an important role and serves as an arena in which different interpretations of populism can be confronted and new meanings can be built. So I think that resumes a little bit what our study was about, and I hope we can engage in further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. In order to start the discussion, I think well, first I want to invite those who joined us via YouTube to post their question in the chat there, and we will be able to see and relay your questions to the participants. And it's the same, of course, goes for the Zoom meeting. Maybe we can start. I know that Julian already asked a question. Maybe we can throw one in, and then Fabio, you could potentially follow up with that one. The first question, if I remember well, was how new are the new media trends? I mean, the social media-based populism, how new is it? I don't know who wants to go first on that.
That's a tricky one. No, it's maybe I can just start to some points. It's a very interesting question indeed, but are they new? In fact, I think the tools, the phenomenon, the context. Also the pandemic context, we saw a lot of think about this, and I think they are not so new, I think, but I think we can see a whole movement, that a context of a movement that specifies the trends we can see from now. It's not that the new media trends and the social media based populism, as Julian wrote, I don't think it's quite new, but maybe you have another opinion, of course. But I think it's quite a world context that give to them I'd say a dynamic, and I think the dynamic, it's maybe the new that we can see, but yeah, it's just as I thought, I'm thinking from now, I think I can say that, but maybe Nina other point of view or ideas.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in the sense that it's not a completely new phenomenon. that it was, I think it was always based on a certain type of social support based on social media in the larger sense of in social relations, in the larger sense of the word. But I think there are some differences that we can point out that are quite important in this new phenomenon. I would say that first we have, especially in the Brazilian case, that I'm more close to. I am more. I can talk about better. I was going to say I was more alés, but that is the perfect confusion between English and I'm so sorry. So in the Brazilian case, we have a very clear change between having a strong political party and a strong social movement that give the base to these populist leaders, to a strong, let's say, social media movements or social media mobilizations. Of course, the one thing does not replace completely the other. They all continue to exist, but I think they are built in different manners. So social media allows populist leaders to build this social base in a different way. And I think there are two, I could think of more, but now I think of two elements that are central in this construction. The first one is that the online environment, especially social media and instant messaging apps, they allow a very close proximity between public and private conversations. So the difference between what is a media and what is a private conversation or a conversation between a group of friends or family or things like that, these limits become very difficult to establish and to see. And I think that leads us to major changes on how the perception of populist leaders is built on. The second element is that also the digital world, the digital reality, the digital communicational space allows us to have different forms of faking public opinion. So, of course, I think there is the online and the offline world are deeply connected. I think there is no sense in talking about a virtual world and a real world and things like that. But we also have to admit that on the online world, there are forms of creating behaviors that are not organic, that are not, of course, that exists offline also, but I think in the digital world, this is much more present. So I think these are some elements from which we could think about this new kind of, let's say, social media populism.
Yeah, and maybe to complete, I totally agree with you. Maybe the link between the political leaders and the people, the elites, maybe it's more strong on the social media, and maybe that some certain groups or some certain kind of people believe then that they are more linked to political leader. Maybe political leaders use that phenomena, and maybe it's quite new compared to populism before social media. I think the link between the people and the political leaders that who say we are not the elite, we are like you, we are like you people, and we can talk in social media. Maybe it's a quite new element compared to the way political communication, populism communication took place before social media. I think it's maybe another element to have in mind. I think that was a tricky question, but it's a very interesting question. Yeah.
The best questions are often quite difficult.
Yeah. That's the point.
Maybe we can actually throw two questions at the same time, and then let the authors, editors react to whichever one they want, so that we can touch upon as many issues as possible during the short time that we have. I'm happy to relay a question from Eduardo Montero, who's a PhD student at Poli-Sci at UCAM. And he writes, during the last weeks, we have seen the impact of a few powerful podcasters on Spotify, YouTube, in the US, and Brazil and Canada, etc. How would you see the impact, not only on misinformation, but on inciting potentially like public manifestation during the ongoing pandemic? That's from Eduardo. And there's also Fabio, I'm just rolling to your question, unless you want to ask it directly. It's more specifically to Nina. You observed that the anti-science firm was the most present in the coverage, and it was mobilized by the BNE as a disqualifying label. So looking at what's going on in the political electoral context in Brazil today, do you think that this was actually a good strategy? Is it going to have a real impact on public opinion?
How do we proceed? Nida, you want to answer to the Fabio question, or maybe the question of Eduardo? So how would you see the impact not only on misinformation, but also on incitation of public manifestation during the pandemic? Yeah. Actually, I'm not working on the reception, discourse reception or communication reception, but I think we can maybe think about some elements. Oh, yeah, another question. So I can't read the question.
Don't worry about the chat. We'll read them out to you.
Yeah.
So maybe I can do some brief comments, as I see there are some questions arriving also here from Brazil. First of all, I would really like to have perfect answers to these questions, but unfortunately, the reality is too complex to do that. But anyway, I'll try to share some thoughts, some insights about the topics. So thank you very much, Eduardo, for your questions. Actually, in this work, I did not research about political movements and impacts, as Cedric was saying. That was not the main issue, but I did work on that, especially on my PhD thesis when I worked about social movements in 2013 in Brazil. And I think it's very interesting to see different kind of movements that are arising from the disinformation topic now. And I think this case of Spotify is especially interesting because it's a kind of mediation that we are not usually talking about. So we are talking about measures that Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, Telegram are taking to prevent or to punish the circulation of disinformation. But there are a lot of digital platforms where this kind of content is circulating, and we actually we don't necessarily pay attention to them. So I think it's very it shows us a face of the phenomenon that we are not usually looking at. And I think I don't see like a great potential of it becoming an enormous movement like street movements, because I think the usage of these tools is not so large yet, but I see it as a new element that can add to other kind of movements that are already going on. So we saw maybe 15 or 20 days ago that Twitter had to implement in Brazil a way to denounce misinformation that was not yet implemented in Brazil, only in other countries because of the public pressure over YouTube and Instagram for a lot of measures that we should take about misinformation. So I think as part of the larger movement, it does add in that sense. About Fabio's question, I think, of course, it did impact on Brazilian public opinion, because I think media always have a certain kind of impact. But I think the tricky thing here, and I will also dialogue with the question from Alonso Jr., is that he asks about if professional journalism helped or fueled populism and the lies the president tells every day. I think the tricky point is that these populist leaders, they use the discourse about delegitimizing the media in their own benefits. So their followers, or their most close followers, they become completely they don't trust major media. They have their own form of consuming media, and that is also a consequence of our the communication environment we have nowadays. So we have a lot of diversity in information sources, and people can choose where they can inform themselves. That has a very positive impact, I think, can have a very positive impact in terms of plurality, diversity, especially in Brazil and Latin America, where we have a very, very centralized and very homogeneous media environment. But on the other hand, that also means that we have a lot of content that is not verified, or that is not necessarily true, that is circulating, and these people can access this kind of content. So I think that is a major problem. And of course, I think that diminishes the impact that major Brazilian media have on public opinion in general. I think it's very segmented by political opinions. And on the question of Alonso, I think that, and also on the question of Moisés about how does populism transform discourse into journalistic discourse, I'm so sorry. How does populism transform discourse into journalistic coverage? I think the main point, I heard some journalists, especially Patricia Campos Melo from Folha de São Paulo, talking about this, is it becomes very difficult for journalists to evaluate how to consider different points of view. To what extent do we consider that this point of view is a valid point of view in a democratic society, in a democratic country? So when we have a public figure like the president of the country that is defending a certain kind of discourse that is completely absurd, anti-scientific, and false, to say it simply, how do we deal with that in terms of media coverage? What do we do with that? I think that is a great challenge that journalism is facing. And I think we could see during the pandemic some moments where I think there was a great disbalance, where you put this completely false discourse as the other side of a reasonable or scientific discourse. And that, I think, is not acceptable in terms of a democratic society. But I admit that I think it's not simple to make that judgment in the day-to-day basis.
Cedric, I saw you shaking head. You want to
maybe
chime in very briefly, because we have also a couple more questions from the audience.
Of course, I think I have some elements about the question of Eduardo, or on other question. I think there is a main issue here is the kind of division of the public sphere and the mediatic public sphere, journalistic public sphere. It's very difficult for journalists to deal with division of public sphere. We have a lot of alternative media that are created on the web that alternative media think they are the legitimate journalism. And for traditional journalism, it's quite difficult to deal with that kind of division of public sphere. And it's quite difficult to understand all the this division. Traditional journalists can't take into account all the this division. They can't talk from all social groups or all people, and it's very difficult for them. And I think it all of this meant to the meta-journalistic issue that that was pointed out, in fact, because we see that new frontier, new borders are delimited by a lot of different people, not only journalists, politicians, citizens, and so on. So it's a real, I think, real issue for journalists to deal with all that kind of very different mediatic public sphere. And I think it's a very tricky question for journalists, I think.
Thank you, Cedric. So there's a number of questions online. I believe Nina mostly answered the one from Antonio Alonso Jr. So I'm going to pose 2 additional ones. The first one is from Waisis Costa Pinto. Sorry about the pronunciation. How does populism transform discourse into journalistic coverage? And then there's an additional question from Ulien. By associating populism to anti-science, did the media have a real impact on Brazilian public opinion? And so feel free, why don't I go to Cedric first this time? Take on one or the other if you have thoughts on that, and then we'll hand it over to Nina next.
Yeah, sure. So how does populism transform discourse into journalistic coverage? That's again, it's a question, very real issue for journalistic. Populism, we see the different way populism discourse in traditional media and alternative media. And I think the issue then it's for populist party to choose some what kind of media they want to be in fact. We saw the media, the media I analysis in my paper. It's an alternative media close to a political party, and there are a lot in France, in Belgium, a lot of that kind of media, and we saw for the past few years a lot of that kind of media close to populist left or right populist parties. And I think that's a way for populist leader to see their discourses in the media. But it's a tricky one for the populist leader, for me, because if they are criticizing the traditional media, and so do they want to be in traditional media or not? It's quite difficult for them because they are criticizing traditional media to be part of the elite, but they also want to be in traditional media. So it's I think it's quite difficult for the political populist leader to deal with that. I think it's some elements can say to Alison, to you, Alison.
Nina?
Yeah, I think I mainly did some comments on both questions, but just one element that occurred to me listening to Cedric's answer, Moises, is that there is, apart from the alternative media option that Cedric already, I think, well explained, I think there is also a very high ability of some populist leaders or populist movements to create, let's say, media events or media positions and opinions that attract media attention. So when you have the whole world worried about a pandemic that just started, and you go on television, on national networks, and say that there's no pandemic, it's only a little cold, and if you do sports, you have nothing. It's so absurd that you generate media coverage. So at the same time that you criticize the existence of this media, you try to delegitimize the existence of this media as fake news media, as Trump said many times in the US. You benefit from the coverage of certain types of behaviors that at a certain level cannot that media cannot avoid to coverage. So if there's a president of a country that goes on television and says something that is so absurd, how can we cannot write about that and produce media content about that? So it's a dual movement, I think, that goes on one side on the delegitimation of this kind of media, and on the other side on the creation of media events or things like that that attract and that benefit from this kind of media coverage. Just some thoughts.
That's great. So thank you. We're running up to the end of our time now. And so I just wanted to take the last few minutes to thank the speakers, to thank the Brazilian Journalism Research Journal for giving us the opportunity to co-direct the special issue that we're launching today. And a special thanks to all of our speakers. So Uliendra Zorman, Fabio Pereira, Nina Santos, and Cédric Kant. So it's been a real pleasure. We look forward to reading your work as it goes forward. And please do check out the special issue, which is available on the BJR website, and it's free access. So check those articles out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.